2 weeks later, official letters arrived at every home in Pinecrest Hills. The HOA board was suspended pending investigation. Mrs. Peterson's campaign manager announced her withdrawal from the city council race for personal reasons. The rezoning application mysteriously disappeared. Most importantly, my garden didn't just survive, it thrived. This spring marks 1 year since our victory. Where one garden stood, 37 now bloom throughout the neighborhood. Yesterday, the school bus stopped so kids could see Mr. Abernathy's giant pumpkins. Mrs. Rodriguez's salsa recipe using my tomatoes won the county fair blue ribbon. Roger's solar panel design powers our community garden irrigation system. Best of all, the new neighborhood association, not HOA, meets monthly in my backyard, where we share seeds, stories, and support. Mrs. Peterson moved away last fall. I sent her a basket of homegrown vegetables as a goodbye gift with a note. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is knowing the law better than those who try to use it against you. I look at my garden now, spreading beautifully across what was once just a driveway, and smile. One small seed of resistance bloomed into something nobody can bulldoze away. Not bad for a garden that was lowering property values. Jake didn't try to make friends. He chose a quiet seat at the back of the class, spoke only when necessary, and avoided any kind of conflict. But ironically, that attracted the wrong kind of attention. At Brookside High, there was a group that acted like they owned the place, led by Chad, an arrogant athlete and the coach's son. The Bullies had a habit of testing every new kid. They saw themselves as kings of the school, and no one dared to challenge them. And Jake? To them, he was just another easy target. One day in the cafeteria, Jake was sitting alone at his table when Chad and his friends approached. "Hey, new guy," Chad said, slamming his hand on the table. "Didn't see you at practice. You planning to join a team, or are you just another loser?" Jake slowly looked up, analyzing Chad and the other guys standing around him. He didn't answer right away. He just went back to eating calmly. The Bullies exchanged glances, laughing. "Look at this! He's mute," one of Chad's friends mocked. "Or maybe he's just a coward," another one added. The entire cafeteria watched, waiting to see how the new kid would react. But Jake didn't seem bothered at all. He simply picked up his tray and, without saying a word, got up and left the cafeteria. That irritated the Bullies. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see fear, but they got nothing. Chad clenched his fists, looking at his friends. "This guy thinks he can ignore us? That's not going to fly." And just like that, Jake's fate was sealed. He would become the new target of Brookside High's Bullies. What Chad and his friends didn't know was that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. It didn't take long for Chad and his friends to start testing Jake. They started small, accidentally bumping into him in the hallways, knocking his books off his desk, making sarcastic comments when he walked by. But Jake never reacted. That only made them more determined. One afternoon, as Jake was leaving the school building, he found his path blocked. Chad and his group stood in front of him, smirking. "Hey, new guy," Chad said, crossing his arms. "You're a hard guy to get a reaction from, but don't worry, we'll change that." Jake stared at him, silent. His expression was unreadable. "Not much of a talker, huh?" One of Chad's friends sneered. "That's okay, we don't need words to have fun." Before Jake could step around them, another one of the Bullies, a large guy named Mark, shoved him. It wasn't enough to knock him down, just enough to test him. Jake staggered slightly, but quickly regained his balance. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't even look angry. That annoyed Chad. "What's wrong?" Chad taunted. "You scared, or do you think you're too good to fight back?" Jake's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Chad chuckled. "That's what I thought, just another coward." Satisfied that they had put Jake in his place, the group laughed and walked away. But they had no idea Jake hadn't reacted, not because he was scared, but because he knew exactly what he was capable of. He had spent years training, honing his skills. He could have ended that confrontation in seconds, but not yet. They weren't worth it. Not yet. The bullying didn't stop, inflated. Chad and his friends became more aggressive, more desperate to break Jake's silence. They tripped him in the hallways, stole his notebooks, even spread rumors about him. And still, no reaction. Until one evening after school, Jake was walking home alone when he heard footsteps behind him. He knew who it was before he even turned around. Chad, Mark, and two of their lackeys stood behind him, grinning. "Hey, new guy," Chad called out. "Where you headed? Thought we'd walk you home." Jake sighed quietly. He had hoped to avoid this. "I'm not interested," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mark scoffed. "Hear that? He's not interested. Too bad. We don't care." The bullies moved in closer, circling him. Jake's eyes darted to the street, empty. No teachers, no witnesses. Chad smirked. "You've been real quiet, Jake. Makes us wonder what you're hiding." Mark lunged first, grabbing Jake's shoulder, and that's when it happened. A blur of movement, too fast for them to register. In one smooth motion, Jake twisted Mark's wrist, spun him around and shoved him forward. Mark lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Chad's eyes widened. "What the?" Jake turned to face them, his expression still eerily calm. "I'm done playing your game," he said. For the first time, Chad felt it, unease. Jake wasn't scared of them. He never was. And something told him this was just the beginning. The next morning at school, rumors spread like wildfire. Mark had shown up with a sore wrist, and though he tried to play it off, everyone noticed the way he avoided talking about what happened. Chad and his crew were furious. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. New kids didn't fight back, especially not like that. Something was off about Jake. Mr. Anderson nodded slowly as if piecing together a puzzle. "Your father, was he in the military?" Jake's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Something like that," he answered. The history teacher didn't press further, but he recognized the signs. Years of discipline, control, and a deep restraint that only came from serious training. "Look, Jake," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I've seen kids like Chad before. Bullies who think power comes from intimidation, but real strength?" He tapped the table lightly. "It comes from knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Jake studied him, his expression unreadable. "And what if walking away isn't an option?" Mr. Anderson sighed. "Then you make sure when you fight, it's for the right reason." Jake absorbed the words, nodding slightly. As Mr. Anderson stood to leave, he added, "If you ever need to talk, my door is always open." For the first time, Jake felt like someone at Brookside High actually saw him, not as a victim, not as a threat, but as a kid trying to figure out his place. Anderson raised an eyebrow. "Trained you?" Jake nodded. "He was a professional fighter, taught me everything he knew." It all made sense now. The stance, the calm demeanor, the way he had taken down Mark without even breaking a sweat. Jake wasn't just some kid who got lucky. He'd been trained to fight. Mr. Anderson exhaled. "Listen, Jake, I know Chad and his friends won't let this go, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about schoolyard bullying anymore." Jake met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready." What neither of them knew was that Chad had been listening outside the library door, and now he knew Jake's secret. And he had a plan. Chad was furious. Jake had humiliated them, not just in private, but now in the eyes of the whole school. And to make things worse, Jake wasn't just some random new kid. He was trained, a real fighter. But Chad wasn't about to back down. If Jake wanted to play tough, then Chad would show him who really ran this school. That afternoon, Chad and his gang spread the word. Something big was going down behind the gym after school. No teachers, no interruptions, just a lesson that needed to be taught. Jake heard the whispers, but acted as if he didn't care. When the final bell rang, students rushed outside, forming a circle near the back of the school. The air was thick with anticipation. Jake arrived last. He wasn't surprised to see Chad, Mark, and 3 more of their friends waiting for him. 5 against 1, Chad smirked. Glad you showed up. Jake sighed. I didn't come here to fight. Chad scoffed. Too bad, 'cause you don't have a choice. Without warning, Mark charged, but he never reached Jake. In a flash, Jake sidestepped, grabbed Mark's arm, and flipped him over onto the pavement. Mark groaned, clutching his back. The crowd gasped. Another one of Chad's goons lunged at Jake, throwing a wild punch. Jake ducked, twisted, and landed a sharp elbow to the guy's ribs, sending him staggering backward. 2 down. The crowd erupted in cheers. They weren't here to see Jake get beaten. They were here to see justice. Chad's face twisted in rage. Get him! The last 2 rushed Jake at once. He moved like lightning, dodging, countering, striking with precision. One of them swung a punch. Jake caught his wrist, spun him around, and sent him crashing into the other. 4 down. Now only Chad was left, and suddenly he wasn't smiling anymore. The crowd grew silent. Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on Chad's. You still think you run this place? Chad clenched his fists, but for the first time in his life he hesitated, and Jake saw it. He smirked. You're not worth it. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Chad standing there, humiliated, defeated, powerless. The crowd erupted in cheers, and just like that, everything changed. The fight behind the gym became the most talked-about event in Brookside High. By the next morning, everyone knew what had happened, how Jake had taken down Chad's entire crew without breaking a sweat. Chad didn't show up to school that day, neither did Mark or the others. For the first time in years, the hallways were free of their bullying. No one got shoved into lockers, no one had their lunch trays knocked over. The fear that had ruled the school for so long was gone, and it was because of Jake. People started looking at him differently. Some whispered in awe, some nodded in silent respect. Even those who had once laughed at him now stayed out of his way. But Jake didn't care about any of that. He hadn't come here to be a hero. So when he walked into the library that afternoon, he was surprised to see Mr. Anderson waiting for him. The teacher gave him a knowing smile. Heard you made quite an impression yesterday. Jake shrugged. Did what I had to do. Mr. Anderson nodded, studying him. You know, I looked up your father. Jake tensed. He had never talked about his father to anyone at this school, except Mr. Anderson. He was a legend, Mr. Anderson continued, undefeated in his prime, but he disappeared from the fighting world. No one knew why. Jake looked down. He left because of me, he said. Said the world of fighting wasn't what it used to be, that people only cared about destruction, not discipline. Mr. Anderson leaned back, folding his arms. And what about you? Do you fight for destruction? Jake exhaled. No, I fight to end fights before they start. Mr. Anderson nodded approvingly. Then I think your father would be proud. Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent years wondering if he was living up to his father's expectations. Hearing those words, especially from someone like Mr. Anderson, meant more than he cared to admit. But the peace at Brookside High wouldn't last forever, because Chad wasn't the type to accept defeat, and he was planning a comeback. Days passed, and Chad was nowhere to be seen. The school felt different, lighter. Students who once lived in fear of his gang walked the halls freely. Laughter replaced tension. Jake, however, knew better than to believe it was over, and he was right. One afternoon, as he left school, he heard footsteps behind him. Not just one set, multiple. He sighed. Took you long enough. Turning around, he saw Chad and Mark standing there. But this time they weren't smirking. They weren't even trying to intimidate him. Chad clenched his jaw, looking at the ground. I was out of line. Jake raised an eyebrow. Mark exhaled. Yeah, we were all idiots. The words hung in the air. It was clear this wasn't easy for them. Chad took a deep breath. Look, I'm not saying we're going to be friends or anything, but you proved your point. He swallowed hard. You were right. I don't run this school. Jake studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Took you long enough to figure that out. Chad scoffed, shaking his head with a smirk. Yeah, well, guess even I can learn a lesson. Without another word, he turned and walked away, Mark following behind him. Jake watched them go, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. Finally, he muttered. Brookside High had changed. The bullies had been humbled. And Jake, he could finally focus on what he came here for, living his life in peace, or at least until the next challenge came his way. Jake's story wasn't just about fighting. It was about standing up for yourself, even when walking away seems easier. Bullies rely on fear, but the moment you stop being afraid, they lose all their power. What do you think? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this.